What if the most important clues about our past were never meant to be found? Buried beneath mountains, sealed behind ancient rock, or hidden under layers of sand and soil, some discoveries have survived for thousands of years without anyone knowing they were there. Then one day, a small crack opens, a forgotten chamber is entered, or a buried object is lifted from the ground, and suddenly the story of humanity becomes a little stranger. Some discoveries confirm what scientists already suspected. Others force researchers to rethink what they thought they knew. And sometimes, the most fascinating part isn't what was found, but what it seems to suggest. Because when you uncover something that has remained untouched since the last ice age, you're not simply finding an old object. You're opening a message from a world that disappeared before recorded history even began. Imagine standing in front of a cave hidden beneath layers of ancient rock. Outside, thousands of years have passed. Entire landscapes have changed. Ice sheets have advanced and retreated. Animals have disappeared. Human civilizations have risen and collapsed. Languages have been invented and forgotten. Yet inside this dark chamber, time seems to have stopped. The cave had been sealed for an extraordinary length of time, protecting whatever was inside from the forces that normally destroy archaeological evidence. Water, oxygen, sunlight, bacteria, animals, and human activity can all erase traces of the past. But when an environment remains closed and stable for thousands of years, it can become something remarkably different. It can become a time capsule. Inside such prehistoric environments, researchers have discovered animal bones, tools, traces of human activity, and other remains that can reveal how people lived during a world almost impossible for us to imagine. This was a time when massive animals still walked across landscapes that would eventually become completely transformed. The climate was colder in many regions, and human communities survived through hunting, gathering, movement, and an intimate understanding of their environment. But here's where the story becomes truly fascinating. For decades, popular stories about prehistoric humans often portrayed them as primitive people struggling simply to survive. Yet archaeology has gradually painted a much more complicated picture. These people understood materials. They understood animals. They understood landscapes. They created tools with specific purposes and passed knowledge from one generation to another. And every new discovery makes that picture more detailed. A single stone tool might reveal how an animal was butchered. A fragment of bone can reveal what someone ate. Charcoal can tell researchers that fire was deliberately used. Pigments can suggest that prehistoric humans were experimenting with color and symbolism. Even the position of an object inside a cave can provide clues about how people moved through the space thousands of years ago. The incredible thing is that none of these discoveries come with instructions. There is no ancient label saying, "This is what we use this for." Archaeologists have to reconstruct the story from tiny fragments. A scratch, a broken bone, a layer of ash, a stone shaped by human hands. Sometimes even the absence of something becomes evidence. And that is what makes archaeology so mysterious. It isn't simply about finding old objects. It's about trying to reconstruct an entire world from pieces that survived by accident. Now imagine a cave that remained sealed for nearly 30,000 years. Inside, researchers can potentially observe a moment in prehistoric history with extraordinary clarity. The walls, sediments, animal remains, and artifacts can preserve evidence of environmental conditions that existed long before modern civilization. But there's a major problem. When a headline says a discovery rewrites history, that doesn't necessarily mean scientists have discovered something impossible. Archaeological headlines often become more dramatic than the evidence itself. A normal scientific discovery can become a sensational story once it reaches the internet. A stone tool becomes proof of a lost civilization. An unusual bone becomes evidence of a mysterious species. A sealed chamber becomes a forbidden room. And suddenly, the original discovery is buried beneath layers of speculation. That is why the real story can be even more interesting. Because genuine science doesn't need a supernatural explanation to be fascinating. Take ancient caves, for example. Researchers can study microscopic layers of sediment and determine how the environment changed over thousands of years. They can analyze animal remains to understand diet and migration. They can examine chemical traces left behind by fires and identify whether humans were present. Modern technology has transformed this process. Archaeologists can now use CT scanning, 3D mapping, ground-penetrating radar, laser scanning, DNA analysis, isotope testing, and microscopic examination to investigate objects without destroying them. Something that once looked like an ordinary piece of bone can now become a biological record. Something that looked like a simple stone can reveal manufacturing marks. And a sealed chamber that once seemed completely silent can suddenly tell researchers about the people who entered it thousands of years ago. But there is another question. Why were some places preserved so perfectly while others disappeared completely? The answer is often a combination of geography and luck. Dry deserts can preserve organic material that would normally rot. Frozen environments can trap remains almost like a natural freezer. Extremely dry caves can protect textiles, bones, wooden objects, and even traces of food. In waterlogged environments, oxygen-free conditions can sometimes prevent normal decomposition. Nature can become an accidental archaeologist. And sometimes, the best discoveries happen because humans left something behind and then never returned. A fire was extinguished. A doorway collapsed. A landslide blocked an entrance. A flood buried a settlement. A layer of sand slowly covered a structure. And eventually, everyone who knew the place existed was gone. Thousands of years later, another group of humans arrives. They don't know what is beneath their feet. They have no idea that the ground around them contains evidence of people who lived before the first pyramids were built, before the first great empires appeared, and before written history became a tool for recording human memory. That is perhaps the most unsettling part. We often think of history as a finished story. We imagine that everything important has already been discovered and placed inside museums. But archaeology tells us the opposite. The world beneath us is still full of gaps. There are settlements whose names have been forgotten, tombs whose owners remain unidentified, objects whose purpose is still debated, ancient roads hidden beneath modern cities, ships resting beneath the sea, caves sealed since prehistoric times. And every discovery has the potential to change the questions we ask. This is especially true when archaeology moves from the prehistoric world into the age of the pharaohs. Because thousands of years after humans were already leaving traces inside caves, another civilization began creating monuments so enormous that we can still see them today. The ancient Egyptians built pyramids, temples, tombs, cities, canals, and monuments designed to survive beyond the lives of the people who created them. They believed memory mattered, names mattered, burials mattered, and they built an entire civilization around the idea that death was not the end. But what happens when a civilization that cared so deeply about preserving memory still manages to lose entire chapters of its own history? What happens when a royal tomb disappears? When a pharaoh's name is erased? When a queen's burial place remains hidden? And what if somewhere behind a tomb that has already been famous for more than a century, there is still another chamber waiting to be investigated? That question leads us toward one of the greatest archaeological mysteries of all. The tomb of a young king whose golden burial mask became one of the most recognizable objects on Earth. Tutankhamun. When Howard Carter entered the tomb in 1922, he wasn't simply opening an ancient burial. He was stepping into a time capsule that had survived for more than 3,000 years. But the treasure inside was only part of the mystery. Because surrounding Tutankhamun's burial are unanswered questions about his family, his sudden rise to power, the mysterious disappearance of Queen Nefertiti, and the possibility that another royal burial could be connected to his own. For decades, researchers have asked whether the famous tomb contains more than what we can see. And if there really is another hidden space, the question becomes even more extraordinary. Who was it built for? Why was it hidden? And could it finally explain what happened to one of ancient Egypt's most mysterious queens? The answer may be buried only a few meters beyond the walls. And if that sounds like the end of the mystery, it isn't. It's where the real investigation begins. For more than a century, the tomb of Tutankhamun has been one of the most famous archaeological discoveries ever made. The golden mask, the sealed chambers, the royal treasures, and the image of a forgotten young pharaoh emerging from darkness have become symbols of ancient Egypt itself. But there is something about this tomb that has never stopped bothering researchers. What if the chamber we know so well is not the entire story? The mystery begins with a name that appears almost everywhere in discussions about Tutankhamun, yet almost nowhere with certainty in the archaeological record: Nefertiti. She was one of the most powerful and recognizable women of the Amarna period. Her famous painted bust shows an elegant woman with an elongated crown, a long neck, and an expression that has survived for more than 3,000 years. But behind that famous face is a historical mystery. What happened to her? Nefertiti was the great royal wife of Pharaoh Akhenaten. Together, they presided over one of the most radical religious transformations in Egyptian history. Akhenaten abandoned the traditional pantheon and elevated the Aten, the solar disk, above the old gods. He established a new capital at Amarna and transformed royal art, architecture, and religious expression. Nefertiti was not simply standing beside him. She appears beside Akhenaten in temples, monuments, and religious scenes with an unusual prominence. In some depictions, she appears almost as powerful as the king himself. Then, sometime during this turbulent period, she disappears from the historical record. No confirmed tomb, no universally accepted mummy, no definitive burial place, and no clear explanation for exactly how her life ended. This is where the mystery surrounding Tutankhamun becomes much more complicated. Tutankhamun lived during the aftermath of Akhenaten's religious revolution. He inherited a kingdom that had been deeply disrupted by his father's policies. The traditional temples had suffered. The old religious order had been challenged. The capital had shifted. And after Akhenaten's death, Egypt began reversing much of what he had done. Tutankhamun became king while still a child. His original name reflected the Aten religion. But after becoming pharaoh, he changed his name to Tutankhamun, honoring Amun, one of the traditional gods. The royal court abandoned Amarna and returned to the old religious centers. It was almost as if Egypt was trying to erase an entire chapter of its own history. And that may be one reason Nefertiti became so difficult to trace. The problem is that the Amarna period was not simply forgotten naturally. Later rulers actively dismantled parts of Akhenaten's legacy. His monuments were damaged, his name was removed from inscriptions, and his capital was abandoned. When a civilization deliberately destroys its own records, historians are left with something extremely difficult to reconstruct, a puzzle with missing pieces. For years, some researchers proposed that Nefertiti might have survived Akhenaten and even ruled Egypt under another name. One theory suggested that she may have taken the throne briefly before Tutankhamun's reign. Another proposed that she could have been buried somewhere near the young king. But theories are not evidence, and this distinction is crucial. The idea that Nefertiti lies somewhere near Tutankhamun's tomb became particularly famous because of the unusual layout of the burial complex. Tutankhamun's tomb is surprisingly small for a pharaoh. Compared with the enormous royal tombs of the Valley of the Kings, its architecture seems almost improvised. There is an entrance corridor, several chambers, and the burial chamber itself. The tomb was clearly important, but it does not resemble the monumental burial complexes expected for a major ruler. That led researchers to ask an intriguing question. Was this tomb originally intended for someone else? Perhaps a royal individual whose burial plans were changed at the last moment? If that happened, the strange architecture might make more sense. Then came another possibility. What if some of the walls were not simply walls? What if they concealed something? In the early 21st century, high-resolution scans of Tutankhamun's tomb generated enormous interest. Researchers began examining the surfaces and architecture in ways that earlier archaeologists could never have done. Thermal imaging was used. Radar studies were discussed. Architectural measurements were compared. And eventually, a controversial theory emerged suggesting that hidden chambers might exist beyond the walls of Tutankhamun's burial chamber. The possibility was electrifying, because if another chamber existed, it could potentially contain objects connected to another member of the royal family. And one name immediately came to mind: Nefertiti. Imagine what that would mean. A queen who vanished from history could suddenly reappear, not through a written record, but through an untouched burial chamber. Her mummy could potentially be identified. Her burial equipment could reveal her status. Inscriptions could clarify the succession after Akhenaten. And artifacts could help answer one of the most persistent questions of the Amarna period. Who really ruled Egypt between Akhenaten and Tutankhamun? But there is a problem. Radar images are not magic windows into the ground. They can detect anomalies, changes in density, voids, or structures, but interpreting those signals can be extremely difficult. Different researchers can examine similar data and reach different conclusions. A suspected chamber can turn out to be a natural feature. A crack can look like an opening. A difference in material can resemble a doorway. And this is where archaeology becomes less like treasure hunting and more like detective work. You don't simply want a fascinating possibility. You need independent evidence. This is also why the Nefertiti theory has remained controversial. Some researchers have argued that the architecture of Tutankhamun's tomb is consistent with the idea of a tomb originally prepared for a high-status individual. Others have pointed out that there is no definitive archaeological evidence proving that Nefertiti was buried there. And there is another complication. Even if a hidden chamber existed, there would be no guarantee that Nefertiti was inside it. It could have belonged to another member of the royal family. It could have been a storage space. It could have been unfinished. It could have been created for ritual purposes. Or it might not exist at all. That last possibility is important, because the most exciting archaeological theories are often the ones that survive precisely because they have not been conclusively proven. They remain suspended between possibility and evidence. Yet the mystery became even more fascinating because of what was found inside Tutankhamun's tomb itself. Among the thousands of objects were items that appeared to have been created for earlier members of the royal family. Some burial equipment seems to have been reused or adapted. Certain objects appear to have originally belonged to other individuals. This was not unusual in ancient Egypt. Royal burials could be assembled quickly, especially when a king died unexpectedly. Tutankhamun himself died young, probably in his late teens. His death may have forced the royal administration to prepare his burial under severe time pressure. That could explain why his tomb is smaller than expected and why some objects appear to have been repurposed. But it also creates another possibility. Perhaps some objects came from the Amarna royal family. Perhaps they belonged to people whose own tombs have never been found. And that brings us back to Nefertiti. The queen's disappearance remains one of the great unanswered questions of Egyptian archaeology. Her name appears frequently during the earlier Amarna period, then becomes increasingly difficult to trace. Whether she died before Akhenaten, survived him, ruled briefly, or was replaced politically remains debated. There are also theories connecting her to the mysterious ruler Neferneferuaten, a figure who may have occupied the throne during the chaotic succession between Akhenaten and Tutankhamun. But again, the evidence is incomplete. The names, titles, and surviving inscriptions create possibilities rather than simple answers. and perhaps that is why the mystery refuses to disappear. Tutankhamun's tomb was discovered more than a century ago, yet it still feels unfinished. The golden mask gave us a face. The burial chamber gave us a king. The artifacts gave us a glimpse into an extraordinary royal world, but they did not give us the complete story. Somewhere in the shadows of the Amarna period are missing rulers, missing burials, erased names, and relationships we may never completely understand. And if another chamber truly exists behind the walls of Tutankhamun's tomb, it could become one of the most important archaeological discoveries of the modern era. But even without a hidden chamber, the mystery has already changed the way we look at ancient Egypt. Because Tutankhamun's tomb teaches us something unsettling. The greatest secrets do not always disappear because they are destroyed. Sometimes they survive. They remain sealed. They wait beneath the surface. And sometimes the only thing separating us from a forgotten chapter of history is a wall that has remained untouched for more than 3,000 years. But Tutankhamun was not the only royal mystery waiting beneath the Egyptian desert. In another part of Egypt, archaeologists would uncover a tomb belonging to a ruler whose name had almost completely vanished from history. The burial had been flooded, abandoned, and stripped of its original treasures. Yet inside were clues that could finally explain the fate of a forgotten pharaoh. His name was Thutmose II, and unlike Tutankhamun, his tomb had been missing for nearly 3,000 years. There are places where history does not simply disappear. It hides. Beneath the desert, beneath collapsed temples, beneath layers of stone that have been silent for thousands of years, entire stories can remain buried without leaving so much as a name behind. And sometimes, the strangest discoveries are not golden treasures or perfectly preserved mummies. Sometimes they are passages, tunnels, empty chambers, places that seem to have been built for a purpose we can no longer understand. And one discovery near Alexandria may be exactly that kind of mystery. Deep beneath the ruins of an ancient Egyptian temple, archaeologists uncovered a perfectly straight underground passage stretching for more than 4,000 feet through solid sandstone. It was buried roughly 43 feet below the surface, hidden beneath layers of rock and debris. At first glance, it might not sound extraordinary, but then you realize what you are looking at. This tunnel was created more than 2,000 years ago, without modern drilling equipment, without laser-guided surveying systems, without digital maps, and without the machinery engineers use today to maintain precision underground. Yet the passage remains remarkably straight and level. For the ancient builders, there was no room for guesswork. A mistake underground could mean disaster. One wrong angle, one incorrect measurement, one section cut too deep, and the entire project could become useless. So how did they do it? That question becomes even more fascinating when we consider where the tunnel was found. It lies near the ancient city of Taposiris Magna, west of Alexandria, a place filled with temples, tombs, statues, coins, and evidence of both Egyptian and Greco-Roman culture. And for years, archaeologists have been searching this region for something far more famous: the lost tomb of Cleopatra. The final queen of Ptolemaic Egypt vanished from history in one of the most dramatic endings imaginable. After the defeat of her forces by Octavian, the future Roman Emperor Augustus, Cleopatra died in 30 BCE. But where was she buried? Ancient writers suggested that Cleopatra and Mark Antony were placed together in a royal tomb. Yet despite centuries of searching, no confirmed burial chamber has ever been found. That uncertainty created one of archaeology's greatest unanswered questions. And when archaeologists discovered a massive underground tunnel beneath a temple dedicated to the goddess Isis, speculation exploded. Could this be connected to Cleopatra? Could the tunnel lead somewhere deeper? Could it be part of a forgotten ceremonial route? Or was it simply an engineering project with a completely different purpose? The evidence does not yet provide a definitive answer. And that is where the real mystery begins. The tunnel is about 6.5 feet tall in places, large enough for a person to move through, but narrow enough to feel strangely confined. Parts of it have been damaged by earthquakes and the movement of water over centuries. Some sections are now submerged. Yet despite all that destruction, enough remains to reveal the extraordinary skill of its builders. Researchers have compared its design with another famous ancient engineering achievement, the Eupalinean Tunnel on the Greek island of Samos. That comparison is important because the Eupalinean Tunnel was not simply a hole dug through a mountain. It was a carefully planned underground water system constructed in the 6th century BCE. Ancient engineers had to calculate where two teams digging from opposite sides would eventually meet. And somehow, they succeeded. The Egyptian tunnel raises similar questions about ancient knowledge. How accurately could Egyptian and Greek engineers measure distance underground? How did they maintain direction? How did they understand gradients? And perhaps most importantly, how much of this knowledge has been lost? We often imagine ancient civilizations as primitive compared with the modern world. But discoveries like this force us to reconsider that assumption. These people did not have computers. They did not have satellites. They did not have digital levels or GPS. Yet they built structures that can still leave modern engineers wondering how they achieved such precision. And the tunnel may have served a purpose far more important than transportation. Ancient Egyptian religious architecture was deeply connected to movement. A person entering a temple was not simply walking from one room to another. The journey itself could represent a transformation. Life, death, darkness, rebirth, the underworld, the gods. An underground passage could therefore have carried symbolic meaning as well as practical function. It may have connected a temple to a water source. It may have played a role in rituals. It may have formed part of a larger sacred landscape that has now been fragmented by earthquakes, rising water, and centuries of destruction. And then there are the artifacts. Nearby excavations have revealed coins, statues, figurines, mummies, and other objects associated with the religious world of ancient Egypt. One particularly unusual discovery was a mummy with a golden tongue. To modern eyes, that sounds almost surreal, but to the ancient Egyptians, it may have had a very specific meaning. The tongue was connected to speech, and speech was believed to remain important in the afterlife. A golden tongue may have symbolized the ability of the deceased to speak before the gods. In other words, even death did not mean silence. The Egyptians were preparing for what came next, and perhaps that is what makes these discoveries so haunting. The people who built these temples and tunnels knew they would eventually disappear. Their bodies would decay. Their kingdoms would collapse. Their cities would be buried. But they designed their monuments to speak for them long after their voices were gone. Thousands of years later, we are still listening. And that brings us back to Cleopatra. The tunnel does not prove that her tomb is nearby. It does not prove that she was buried beneath the temple. And it certainly does not confirm the existence of a secret chamber belonging to Nefertiti or any other famous Egyptian ruler. Those claims remain theories. But archaeology rarely moves forward because someone finds exactly what they expected. It moves forward because something unexpected appears. A tunnel where no tunnel was supposed to be. A forgotten city beneath another civilization. A tomb without a name. A sealed chamber. A strange inscription. A piece of pottery bearing the name of someone history nearly erased. Every discovery creates another question. And that is why Egypt remains so difficult to leave behind. Because just when we think the map is complete, the ground opens again. A few feet beneath our feet, something waits. Not necessarily treasure, sometimes something more valuable. Evidence. Evidence that tells us the ancient world was larger, more complicated, and far more sophisticated than we once imagined. And somewhere beneath the stones of Egypt, there may still be a chamber that has never seen modern eyes. If Cleopatra's tomb is ever found, It could transform our understanding of the final days of Ptolemaic Egypt. But even if that chamber never appears, the search itself has already revealed something remarkable. The ancient Egyptians did not simply leave monuments behind. They left a puzzle. And every generation solves one piece, only to discover that behind it is another door. And perhaps somewhere in the darkness beneath the desert, that door is still waiting to be opened. For thousands of years, the desert has been hiding something from us. Not a single treasure, not a single tomb, but an entire city. A place that existed during one of the most dramatic periods in ancient Egyptian history, when kings were changing the gods, families were fighting for power, and the old order was beginning to collapse. Then, buried beneath layers of later ruins near Alexandria, archaeologists found evidence that forced them to redraw the map. The discovery happened at a site known as Kom el Nogus, west of Alexandria, between the Mediterranean Sea and Lake Mariot. For a long time, researchers believed this region had been largely empty before the arrival of the Greeks in the 4th century BCE. But the ground had a different story. As archaeologists carefully removed layers of Greek and later material, something unexpected appeared beneath them. Mud brick walls. Not Greek walls, Egyptian walls. The bricks had been made from mud, sand, clay, and plant material, then dried beneath the brutal Egyptian sun. They were the kind of building materials used across Egypt for thousands of years, from ordinary homes to enormous royal complexes. One wall might have been interesting, but then another appeared, and another. Soon, archaeologists began recognizing streets, structures, drainage systems, and evidence of organized settlement. This was not an isolated building. It was a forgotten Egyptian community. And the deeper they looked, the stranger the story became. The settlement appeared to have existed roughly 3,400 years ago during the New Kingdom, a period when Egypt was one of the most powerful civilizations on Earth. And among the discoveries was evidence connected to one of Egypt's most famous rulers, Ramesses the Great. Ramesses II ruled for decades, commanded armies, built enormous monuments, and left his name carved across Egypt. His reign became so legendary that later rulers sometimes reused his name and imagery to associate themselves with his power. Finding evidence of his presence at this forgotten settlement was therefore significant. But the city was older than Ramesses, and that detail may be even more important. One of the most intriguing objects discovered at the site was a fragment of a ceramic vessel bearing a royal seal connected to Meritaten, the eldest daughter of Pharaoh Akhenaten and Queen Nefertiti. Suddenly, this forgotten settlement was connected to one of the most controversial royal families in Egyptian history. Akhenaten was not an ordinary pharaoh. He attempted to transform Egyptian religion itself. For centuries, Egypt had worshipped a vast collection of gods and goddesses. Osiris, Isis, Horus, Amun, Ra, Thoth, Set, and many others had their own temples, priests, rituals, and traditions. Akhenaten tried to change all of that. He elevated the Aten, the radiant disk of the sun, above the traditional gods and established a new religious order. Then he did something even more radical. He abandoned the traditional capital and created an entirely new city called Akhetaten, modern-day Amarna, in the middle of the desert. It was an enormous experiment. A new city, a new religion, a new artistic style, and a royal family placed at the center of it all. Akhenaten and Nefertiti were portrayed in ways that looked radically different from traditional Egyptian art. Their bodies appeared elongated, their faces unusual, their family scenes unusually intimate. Their daughters appeared beside them. And among those daughters was Meritaten. Her image appears repeatedly in the art of the Amarna period, suggesting that she held an unusually important position within the royal family. But after Akhenaten's death, everything changed. The religious revolution began collapsing. The old gods returned. The temples that had been closed were reopened. Akhenaten's name was attacked. His monuments were dismantled. His memory was deliberately pushed into the shadows. And the royal family that had once stood at the center of Egypt's religious transformation became one of the greatest mysteries in Egyptian history. Then came Tutankhamun. The young king inherited a broken political and religious system. He eventually restored the traditional gods and abandoned much of his father's religious program. Even his name reflected the change. The young king who had once been associated with the Aten became Tutankhamun, connected once again with the traditional god Amun. And now, evidence from Qom el-Nogus suggests that the influence of this royal family reached farther north than previously understood. The settlement was not simply residential. Evidence suggests it may have had military importance. Small tomb chapels contained inscriptions associated with soldiers. That raises a disturbing question. Why would soldiers be stationed here? Was the settlement protecting an important trade route? Was it controlling agricultural production? Was it defending access to the Mediterranean? Or was something else happening at the edge of the desert? The answer may involve something surprisingly ordinary: wine. The discovery of the ceramic vessel connected to Meritaten suggests that wine production and distribution may have played an important role in this region. Ancient Egyptian wine was not simply a drink. It was a symbol of status, religion, trade, and power. Vineyards required land, water, workers, storage facilities, and protection. A settlement capable of producing and distributing wine could therefore become strategically important. And this city may have been exactly that: a place where military power, agriculture, religion, and trade came together. But the city still has another mystery. We do not yet know its ancient name. Think about that for a moment. We can walk through its streets. We can examine its walls. We can study its pottery. We can identify the royal family connected to some of its artifacts. Yet the people who lived there left behind no obvious sign telling us what they called their home. The name may still be buried somewhere beneath the soil. It could be hidden inside an administrative document. It could be carved into a wall. It could be written on another fragment of pottery. Or perhaps it disappeared forever. That uncertainty is what makes archaeology so fascinating. A civilization can leave behind millions of objects and still hide the simplest answer. Who were these people? What did they call their city? Why did they live there? And why did they leave? The answers may be waiting beneath structures that archaeologists have not yet reached. The settlement could contain warehouses, military buildings, administrative offices, religious structures, fortifications, or perhaps an entirely different discovery that nobody is expecting. And that is the pattern we keep seeing across Egypt. The more archaeologists uncover, the less complete the ancient world appears. We once imagined Egypt as a collection of famous landmarks: the pyramids, the Sphinx, Luxor, the Valley of the Kings, Alexandria. But beneath that familiar map lies another Egypt. An Egypt of forgotten towns, buried roads, hidden temples, unidentified rulers, lost workers, unknown soldiers, and ordinary people whose lives rarely appeared in royal inscriptions. That may be the most important part of this discovery, because history is usually written around kings. But civilizations are built by everyone else. The farmers who grew the crops, the workers who shaped the bricks, the sailors who moved goods along the coast, the soldiers who guarded the roads, the craftsmen who produced pottery, the families who lived inside those mud brick houses. Their names may be gone. Their voices may be silent. But the city they built remained underground for more than 3,000 years, waiting. And now, piece by piece, it is coming back. Not as a legend, not as a myth, but as physical evidence. A wall, a street, a broken vessel, a royal seal, and perhaps, somewhere beneath the ruins, one final inscription that could reveal the name of the forgotten city and explain why it mattered. Because sometimes the greatest discoveries are not the ones that answer an ancient mystery. They are the ones that prove the mystery was much bigger than anyone imagined. For more than 3,000 years, one Egyptian ruler seemed to have vanished almost completely. His name survived in fragments. His mummy survived. His relatives survived. But his tomb was gone. And then, in the mountains west of Luxor, archaeologists found a doorway that had been waiting in darkness since the reign of Thutmose II. At first, they had no idea what they were looking at. The tomb was known simply as C4. Its location made researchers think it might belong to a royal woman, possibly one of the wives connected to Thutmose III. It was also close to the tombs associated with Hatshepsut, the woman who would eventually become one of the most powerful rulers in Egyptian history. But the evidence slowly began to change the story. Inside the damaged chambers, archaeologists discovered alabaster vessels bearing the name of Thutmose II. And then came the words that changed everything. Deceased king. The forgotten tomb finally had an owner. Thutmose II, a pharaoh who had ruled Egypt roughly 3,500 years ago. A king whose reign lasted only a few years. A ruler overshadowed by the giants who came before and after him. And yet, his newly identified tomb may help explain one of the most complicated royal successions in ancient Egypt. Because Thutmose II was not simply another pharaoh. He was the husband of Hatshepsut. And after his death, his family would become the center of a political struggle that changed Egyptian history. But first, there was a problem. The tomb was almost completely empty. At first, that sounds like the work of ancient thieves. But this time, the story was different. The tomb had been destroyed by water. Not a small leak. A catastrophic flood. The burial chamber had been built beneath a natural waterfall, and sometime shortly after Thutmose II was buried, water rushed through the tomb. Mud and debris filled the corridors. The ceiling collapsed in places. The original burial equipment was damaged or displaced. The ancient Egyptians were forced to intervene. They removed the king's body and whatever valuable objects they could save. Then they moved his burial somewhere safer. That explains something that had puzzled archaeologists for generations. When Thutmose II's mummy was discovered in the 19th century, it was not in his original tomb. It had been hidden with other royal mummies in a secret cache. Priests had moved the remains of earlier kings there centuries after their original burials had been threatened by tomb robbers. Thutmose II had therefore been buried twice. First in the tomb that has now been rediscovered, and later in a hidden refuge designed to protect him. The tomb itself contains another clue. A secondary corridor appears to have been added to the structure. Researchers believe it may have been created to remove the king's body after the flood. Imagine the scene. The pharaoh had been buried. The rituals were complete. The tomb was sealed. Then water began entering. The people responsible for protecting the royal burial had to return. They entered the flooded corridors, recovered the body, and somehow transported the remains back through the damaged passage. Thousands of years later, archaeologists were forced to crawl through some of those same confined spaces. One passage was only around 16 inches high in places. For anyone with claustrophobia, it would have been a nightmare. But beyond the debris was the burial chamber. And even though the chamber had been emptied, it still contained something extraordinary. Fragments of decoration, traces of blue inscriptions, yellow stars, and passages from the Book of the Dead or funerary texts intended to help the deceased navigate the dangerous journey into the afterlife. The Egyptians believed death was not the end. It was a transition. The deceased had to pass through darkness, confront supernatural dangers, and reach the realm of the gods. The tomb was therefore more than a grave. It was a machine for eternity. Every corridor had meaning. Every symbol had purpose. Every word could potentially protect the dead. And for Thutmose II, those symbols remained on the walls even after everything else had been taken away. But who was this forgotten king? His position in history is strangely awkward. Before him stood Thutmose I, a powerful warrior who expanded Egyptian influence deep into Nubia. After him came Thutmose III, one of Egypt's greatest military rulers. Thutmose III launched campaign after campaign and expanded Egypt's territory to its greatest extent. And between these two powerful rulers was Thutmose II, the Middle King, the one people often overlook. His reign may have lasted only around 4 or 5 years. He died young, possibly around his early 30s. And because so little is known about his accomplishments, his reign has often been treated as a brief chapter between more important rulers. But his marriage changed everything. Thutmose II married his half-sister, Hatshepsut. At the time, royal marriages were not unusual in the Egyptian royal family. The purpose was political, religious, and dynastic. But nobody could have predicted what would happen next. When Thutmose II died, his heir Thutmose III was still a child. Hatshepsut initially became regent. She was supposed to govern on behalf of the young king. But then something extraordinary happened. Hatshepsut took the throne herself. She became pharaoh. And she ruled Egypt with remarkable confidence. Her reign produced enormous building projects, economic prosperity, and one of the most famous trading expeditions in Egyptian history. She was probably in her late 30s or early 40s when she died. By ancient Egyptian standards, she had already lived a relatively long life. But her social status appears to have been significant. Her body had been carefully prepared. She was wrapped in linen. Her eyes were replaced with artificial ones. And she was placed inside an elaborate cartonnage coffin. Cartonnage sounds strange to modern ears, but the material was remarkably effective. It was made by layering linen and papyrus with adhesive, then shaping the material into a rigid shell. Once dried, it became surprisingly strong. And in Egypt's dry climate, these coffins could survive for thousands of years. But Lady Chenette Ah's coffin contained an unusual secret. Researchers at the Field Museum in Chicago eventually used CT scanning to examine the mummy without opening or damaging it. The technology essentially allowed them to see through the coffin and reconstruct the body in 3 dimensions. And what they discovered was ingenious. The coffin had not been built around the body in the normal way. Instead, the craftsmen built the coffin first. Then they softened the material with moisture. Once flexible, it could be carefully molded around the wrapped body. A narrow opening was created along the back. The body was positioned inside. Then the opening was stitched and secured. The result was a coffin that looked almost completely sealed. The tiny opening near the feet was simply part of the construction process. The mystery had finally been solved. But the technique tells us something much bigger about ancient Egypt. These people were not simply preserving bodies. They were engineering the future. To the ancient Egyptians, death was not an ending. It was a journey. And the body was essential for that journey. The soul needed a recognizable physical form. The name had to survive. The organs had to be protected. The tomb had to be prepared. The deceased needed food, clothing, objects, and symbolic protection. Everything had a purpose, even the eyes. Ancient Egyptians believed the dead would need to see in the afterlife, so artificial eyes could be placed inside the sockets. The goal was not merely to make the mummy look human. It was to restore its ability to exist in the next world. This belief explains why Egyptian burial rituals became so elaborate. The body was transformed into a kind of time capsule. And Lady Chenette Ah is one of the clearest examples of how carefully that process could be carried out. But she was not the only mummy to reveal something extraordinary. Thousands of miles away, another perfectly preserved body told an entirely different story. In China, archaeologists discovered the remains of a woman who became famous as Lady Di. Her real name was Xin Jui. She lived during the Western Han Dynasty more than 2,000 years ago. Unlike Lady Chinet Ah, Xin Jui was not Egyptian. Yet the similarities are fascinating. Both women belonged to wealthy social classes. Both were surrounded by objects intended for the afterlife, and both were preserved with extraordinary care. But Xin Jui's burial was on another level. Her coffin was surrounded by multiple layers of protection. She was placed inside several nested wooden coffins, one inside another. They were wrapped in layers of silk and protected with charcoal and white clay. The burial chamber created an environment that helped slow decomposition dramatically. When archaeologists finally examined her body, they were stunned. Her skin remained soft. Her joints could still move. Her hair survived. Her eyelashes survived. Even traces of blood were detected. It was as though time had stopped. But modern science also revealed something much more personal. Xin Jui had not been perfectly healthy. Her body showed evidence of heart disease, diabetes, high blood pressure, liver problems, spinal degeneration, and gallstones. Her final moments may have been connected to a heart attack. And then researchers discovered one of the strangest details. More than 100 melon seeds were found inside her digestive system. That suggests she had eaten watermelon shortly before her death. Think about that. Thousands of years later, archaeologists were able to reconstruct not only how someone died, but what they may have eaten shortly before their final moments. It makes the ancient world suddenly feel human. This was not simply a noble woman frozen in history. She was a person who ate food, experienced pain, enjoyed luxury, and lived an ordinary life inside an extraordinary world. Her tomb contained more than 1,000 objects: silk clothing, food, musical instruments, cosmetics, wooden figures, everyday possessions, objects designed to accompany her into eternity. Among them were more than 100 carved wooden figures representing servants and musicians. Whether they represented real people or symbolic servants, their presence reveals what the Han elite expected from the afterlife. Death was not imagined as an empty void. It was another existence, and the wealthy wanted that existence to resemble the one they had enjoyed in life. The Egyptians believed something similar. The difference was in the details. They created elaborate tombs. The Chinese created nested coffins and sealed burial chambers. Different civilizations, different religions, different techniques, but the same fundamental fear: being forgotten. That fear may explain one of ancient Egypt's most disturbing discoveries. 16 severed human right hands were found buried in pits. They were not random remains. The placement suggested something deliberate. Ancient Egyptian art and texts describe warriors presenting the severed right hands of defeated enemies as proof of victory. The hand could become evidence, a symbol of conquest, a trophy, and perhaps, in a deeper religious sense, a way of stripping an enemy of power. The discovery was disturbing because it transformed something normally associated with the battlefield into an archaeological record. These were not simply bones. They were evidence of a ritualized act, and the identities of the victims may point toward conflicts between Egyptians and the Hyksos, foreign rulers who controlled parts of Egypt during the Second Intermediate Period. The ancient world was not peaceful. Behind the temples and golden masks were wars, political struggles, disease, violence, and death. Yet the same civilization that practiced brutal rituals also created some of the most sophisticated systems for honoring the dead. That contradiction is everywhere. Egyptian priests could preserve a body with astonishing precision. Warriors could return from battle carrying trophies. Families could bury their loved ones beneath enormous monuments. and ordinary people could leave behind tiny objects that accidentally survive for thousands of years. Sometimes those objects are more revealing than royal treasures. A piece of pottery, a wooden game piece, a scratched note, a forgotten tool, or even the contents of someone's stomach. Every artifact is a message from someone who never expected us to find it. And perhaps that is why mummies continue to fascinate us. They are not just ancient bodies. They are direct physical connections to people who lived before our civilizations existed in their current form. Their bones reveal disease. Their teeth reveal diet. Their injuries reveal violence. Their clothing reveals status. Their burial reveals beliefs. And their preservation reveals technology. Lady Chinette Ah's coffin tells us that ancient craftsmen understood materials well enough to construct a seemingly impossible sealed shell. Lady Di tells us that preservation could be achieved through an extraordinary combination of burial architecture, chemistry, climate, and craftsmanship. And the severed hands remind us that the ancient world could be every bit as brutal as it was brilliant. These discoveries force us to look beyond the glamorous image of ancient civilization. Behind every golden mask was a human being. Behind every tomb was a family. Behind every ritual was a belief. And behind every mummy was a story. Some stories are written on walls. Some are carved into stone. And some are hidden inside the bodies themselves. The strange thing is that thousands of years later, we are still learning how to read them. And the more we learn, the more one truth becomes impossible to ignore. The dead have been silent for millennia, but they have never truly stopped speaking. For thousands of years, ancient Egyptians prepared for death as if they were preparing for a journey. They filled tombs with food, clothing, jewelry, furniture, religious texts, and objects they believed would be needed in the next world. But among all those possessions, there was one thing that may have mattered more than gold: the name. To the ancient Egyptians, a person's name was not simply a label. It was part of their identity, their existence, their connection to the world. If your name survived, some part of you survived. If your name was erased, forgotten, or destroyed, your existence could disappear with it. That belief makes one recent archaeological discovery especially haunting. Deep beneath the sacred landscape of Abydos, archaeologists uncovered a massive royal tomb dating back roughly 600 years. The structure was clearly built for someone important. The entrance was decorated with golden images of powerful deities. The chambers were enormous. The architecture resembled royal burials associated with a mysterious period of Egyptian history. But there was one problem. The name of the king was missing. The very thing that should have identified the ruler had disappeared. Imagine spending years building a monumental tomb, filling its walls with religious symbols, preparing your body for eternity, and making certain that everyone would know who you were. Then imagine thousands of years passing. Your kingdom collapses. Your monuments disappear beneath sand. Your name fades. And eventually, archaeologists enter your tomb and cannot even tell who you were. For the ancient Egyptians, that would have been terrifying, because the dead depended on memory. And Abydos was perhaps the most important place in Egypt for that idea. The ancient Egyptians associated Abydos with Osiris, the god of the dead and resurrection. According to Egyptian mythology, Osiris was murdered and dismembered by his brother Set. His body was scattered. His wife Isis searched for the pieces, restored him, and helped bring him back to life. Osiris eventually became ruler of the underworld. Because of this story, Abydos became one of Egypt's most sacred places. Pilgrims traveled there. Temples were built there. Funerary rituals were performed there. And pharaohs wanted to be connected to the place where Osiris was believed to have been buried. For them, Proximity to Abydos was almost like having a direct connection to resurrection. That is why the discovery of a mysterious royal tomb there is so important. The tomb was hidden beneath a rocky rise known as Anubis Mountain. Even the name sounds like something from a forgotten Egyptian legend. Anubis, the jackal-headed god, was associated with embalming, cemeteries, and the protection of the dead. The tomb was buried roughly 23 feet underground. Inside were mud brick vaults, rising more than 16 feet. That is an enormous structure for a burial site. But when archaeologists reached the chambers, they found that the tomb had already been robbed. Its treasures were gone. Its identity was damaged. And the ruler's name could not be confidently read. Yet the tomb still contained clues. Images of Isis and Nephthys appeared near the entrance. These two goddesses played critical roles in the mythology surrounding death and resurrection. Isis was associated with magic, motherhood, and the restoration of Osiris. Nephthys was connected with mourning and protection. Together, they symbolically guarded the dead. Their presence confirms that the tomb belonged to someone who expected to travel through the Egyptian afterlife under divine protection. But who? The answer may lie in one of Egypt's most chaotic periods, the Second Intermediate Period. This was a time when Egypt was not controlled by one unified royal power. Different kingdoms and dynasties competed for territory. Foreign rulers controlled parts of the north. Local rulers controlled areas farther south. Political power shifted constantly. And in the middle of this instability, Abydos developed its own royal dynasty, the Abydos dynasty. For centuries, these kings were almost ghosts. They were mentioned in fragments. Their names appeared on damaged objects. Their monuments were limited. There was little evidence that could tell historians who they really were. Some scholars once questioned how important these rulers had been. Then archaeology changed the story. In 2014, researchers discovered the tomb of a ruler known as Senebkay. And suddenly, one of those mysterious kings had a body. His skeleton revealed something extraordinary. He had suffered numerous violent injuries. There were wounds across his skull, back, and hands. The evidence suggested he may have died in battle. For a civilization where royal death was usually presented as controlled and divine, the physical remains of a king showing battlefield injuries were remarkable. Senebkay was no longer just a name. He was a real person who had fought and apparently died violently. His tomb helped prove that the Abydos dynasty was more than a historical theory. And now, the newly discovered royal tomb could reveal another ruler from the same mysterious period. Its architecture shares similarities with the tomb of Senebkay: limestone chambers, mud brick vaults, protective deities. A royal burial design created for someone who expected to continue existing beyond death. But this tomb is considerably larger. That raises an intriguing possibility. Could the unknown ruler have been more powerful than Senebkay? Could this have been one of the major kings of Abydos? Or perhaps someone who ruled earlier and established the dynasty's power? At the moment, the evidence cannot answer that question. And that uncertainty is exactly what makes the discovery so important. Archaeologists do not need to know everything immediately. Sometimes the most valuable discovery is simply the existence of the evidence. A tomb tells us that someone mattered. Its size tells us something about resources. Its architecture tells us something about tradition. Its inscriptions reveal beliefs. Its location tells us about political geography. Even an empty tomb can speak. And this one is speaking loudly. But there is another discovery nearby that reveals what happened to this sacred landscape long after the pharaohs disappeared. In the village of Vanuit, archaeologists uncovered a Roman-era pottery workshop. At first, that may sound unrelated. A royal tomb from ancient Egypt on one side. A pottery factory centuries later on the other. But together, they reveal something fascinating. Abydos did not simply stop mattering when the pharaohs disappeared. the region continued to attract people. The Roman workshop contained kilns, storage areas, and large quantities of pottery fragments. Some of those fragments were ostraca. These were pieces of pottery used as cheap writing surfaces. Instead of wasting expensive papyrus, people could scratch notes onto broken pottery. Receipts, names, transactions, records, everyday information. These fragments may seem insignificant compared with royal monuments, but in many ways, they are more intimate. A king's inscription tells you what the king wanted people to remember. An ordinary receipt tells you what someone actually did. Someone bought something. Someone sold something. Someone owed someone else money. Someone recorded an ordinary event. And those tiny fragments survived. Then, centuries later, the same landscape was used again. Archaeologists found medieval graves containing human remains. Different people, different religion, different culture, different rituals, but the same sacred ground. That raises a fascinating possibility. Perhaps Abydos retained its spiritual reputation long after the original Egyptian religious system disappeared. The gods changed. The languages changed. The political powers changed. But the place itself remained important. For thousands of years, people returned to this landscape. That is the true mystery of Abydos. Not simply what lies beneath the sand, but why humans kept coming back. Maybe it was the connection with Osiris. Maybe it was the ancient temples. Maybe it was tradition passed down through generations. Or perhaps sacred landscapes develop a power of their own. A place becomes important because people believe it is important. Then that belief survives long enough to become part of the landscape itself. And now, modern archaeologists are entering that landscape with technologies ancient Egyptians could never have imagined. Ground-penetrating radar, geophysical surveys, digital mapping, advanced imaging. These tools allow researchers to examine the ground without immediately destroying it. A hidden chamber can sometimes be detected before a single stone is moved. A buried wall can appear as a signal beneath the surface. A forgotten structure can be mapped from above. And somewhere beneath Abydos, there may still be more. Perhaps another tomb. Perhaps the missing name of the unknown king. Perhaps a burial chamber that escaped ancient robbers. Or perhaps nothing. Archaeology is full of disappointment. But it is also full of moments when the impossible suddenly becomes real. A king once believed to be forgotten can return. A city can rise from beneath the sand. A tunnel can reappear after thousands of years. A mummy can reveal what a person ate before death. And a damaged inscription can restore a name that history tried to erase. That is why this nameless pharaoh matters. Because somewhere beneath the layers of history is a person who once believed his name would survive forever. It didn't, but his tomb did. And now, after 3,600 years of silence, archaeologists may finally have the chance to give him back the one thing the ancient Egyptians feared losing most: his name. What if one of the greatest mysteries of ancient Egypt was never truly buried? What if beneath the stones we have already explored, there is still a hidden chamber waiting to reveal the identity of a queen whose disappearance has confused historians for more than 3,000 years? For decades, archaeologists have searched for answers surrounding one of Egypt's most fascinating royal figures, Nefertiti. She was the powerful queen who stood beside Pharaoh Akhenaten during one of the most radical periods in Egyptian history. Her face is instantly recognizable from the famous painted bust discovered at Amarna. But after a certain point in history, Nefertiti seems to vanish. No clear tomb, no confirmed burial chamber, no undisputed mummy, just silence. And that silence has created one of the most persistent theories in Egyptology. Could Nefertiti's final resting place have been hidden somewhere inside the tomb of Tutankhamun? The idea sounds almost impossible. Yet for a time, archaeological evidence appeared to point directly toward the possibility. When Howard Carter entered Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922, he expected a royal burial. What he discovered instead became one of the most extraordinary archaeological finds ever made. Behind the sealed entrance were chambers filled with gold, statues, chariots, weapons, jewelry, ceremonial objects, and the famous golden burial mask. Tutankhamun's tomb had survived largely intact for thousands of years. But there was something strange about its design. The tomb was unusually small for a pharaoh. Its layout seemed more appropriate for a private burial than the enormous royal tombs normally constructed for kings. And then there were the walls. Researchers noticed unusual features in the burial chamber that raised questions about whether the structure had originally been designed for someone else. That someone, according to one controversial theory, could have been Nefertiti. Imagine the possibility. A young king dies unexpectedly. His burial must happen quickly. The royal court already has a prepared tomb. Instead of constructing a completely new burial complex, workers modify an existing one. The original occupant disappears from the record. And centuries later, archaeologists enter the chamber believing they have found the tomb of Tutankhamun. But behind the decorated walls could be something else. A sealed passage. Another burial. Another name. Another story. For a while, radar scans appeared to provide fuel for this possibility. Researchers using ground-penetrating radar reported anomalies behind the walls of Tutankhamun's burial chamber. To some, these looked like possible corridors or hidden rooms. The excitement was enormous. If a hidden chamber existed, it could potentially contain objects belonging to Nefertiti, perhaps even her mummy. And if that happened, one of ancient Egypt's greatest mysteries could finally be solved. But archaeology has a dangerous habit. It rewards patience and punishes certainty. Further investigations failed to provide conclusive evidence that a hidden chamber actually existed. Some radar interpretations suggested empty spaces. Other analyses challenged those conclusions. The debate became a reminder that ancient mysteries are not solved simply because a machine produces an interesting image. Stone can confuse radar. Natural geological features can resemble walls. Modern disturbances can appear like ancient architecture. And expectations can influence interpretation. Still, the possibility refuses to disappear completely, because Nefertiti's story remains deeply incomplete. She wasn't simply a queen standing beside a pharaoh. She was one of the central figures of the Amarna revolution. Akhenaten attempted to transform Egyptian religion itself. Traditional gods were pushed aside. The sun disk Aten became the focus of royal worship. A new capital was established far from the traditional centers of power, and the royal family became the center of an entirely new artistic and religious world. Nefertiti appears everywhere in the surviving art. She is shown beside Akhenaten. She appears with their daughters. She participates in religious ceremonies. In some depictions, her status seems unusually powerful for a queen. And then suddenly, the evidence becomes unclear. Her name becomes harder to trace. Her later life is uncertain. Her death is uncertain. Her burial is uncertain. Even the exact circumstances surrounding her final years remain debated. It is almost as if someone removed the final pages from her story. And that is where the mystery becomes darker. Ancient Egypt cared deeply about memory. A person's name was not simply a label. It was part of their existence. To preserve someone's name was, in a sense, to preserve that person. To erase it was an attack on their legacy. After Akhenaten's death, Egypt turned against much of what he had created. His religious revolution was abandoned. The old gods returned. The capital at Amarna was deserted. Monuments associated with the Aten religion were dismantled or repurposed. The names of Akhenaten and his family were removed from monuments. And perhaps this is why Nefertiti became so difficult to find. Her disappearance may not have been caused by the passage of time alone. It may have been helped by deliberate historical erasure. Then came Tutankhamun. The boy king became the symbol of Egypt's return to the old religious order. His name survived. His tomb survived. His golden mask survived. But the family secrets surrounding him remained. Who exactly was his mother? What happened to Nefertiti? Who ruled Egypt during the confusing years between Akhenaten and Tutankhamun? And where were the missing royal burials? These questions are connected by one extraordinary period in Egyptian history, a period of political instability, religious revolution, royal marriages, mysterious deaths, and missing tombs. Even Tutankhamun's own burial tells a strange story. The tomb was filled with objects that appear to have been created for other people. Some objects were modified for the young king. Others may have been prepared for earlier royal figures. Thousands of years later, archaeologists entered the same damaged tomb and found evidence of that emergency operation. The tomb itself became a message from the past, not just about death, but about disaster and human response. Even the ancient Egyptians, masters of monumental architecture, could not completely control nature. The same is true of many ancient sites across Egypt. Earthquakes collapsed temples. Floods buried settlements. Sand swallowed monuments. Rising groundwater destroyed structures. And sometimes entire cities disappeared beneath the landscape. One of the most fascinating examples can be found near Alexandria. Archaeologists investigating the area discovered evidence of a settlement that existed long before the Greeks established Alexandria. For centuries, the region was thought to have been largely empty before the arrival of Greek settlers. Then the excavations revealed something unexpected: ancient Egyptian mud brick structures, streets, drainage systems, religious buildings, and evidence suggesting military activity. The discovery changed the story. This wasn't an empty landscape waiting for Greek civilization. People had already been living, trading, building, and organizing communities there. And one small object helped reveal the connection: a ceramic vessel fragment carrying a royal seal. The name belonged to Meritaten, daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. Suddenly, the forgotten settlement was connected to one of the most controversial royal families in Egyptian history: Akhenaten, Nefertiti, Meritaten, Tutankhamun. 4 names connected to a period when Egypt's traditional religious order was turned upside down. Akhenaten attempted to replace Egypt's traditional gods with the worship of the Aten, the solar disk. He moved the royal court to a new capital. He changed artistic traditions. He changed religious practices. And he placed his own family at the center of this new world. But after his death, much of his legacy was dismantled. His city was abandoned. His monuments were destroyed or reused. His name was erased. And his family became increasingly difficult to trace. That makes discoveries associated with this period incredibly important. Because every new artifact can reconnect pieces of a story that ancient authorities deliberately tried to break apart. And sometimes, the evidence comes from something as ordinary as a wine jar. The ancient Egyptians produced wine on a surprisingly large scale. Vineyards existed in several regions. Wine was consumed by elites. It was used during rituals. It was traded. And it could travel long distances. A royal seal on a vessel can therefore tell archaeologists much more than who owned the jar. It can reveal political connections, trade networks, economic organization, and the geographic reach of royal authority. That means an ordinary-looking piece of pottery can become a map of an ancient empire. But there is another discovery that reveals something even more personal. Ancient Egyptians didn't just leave behind temples and tombs. they left behind games. One ancient board game, Senet, has been found in royal burials and other Egyptian sites. It may have been entertainment, but it also had religious meaning. The game was associated with the journey into the afterlife. Imagine a pharaoh sitting in a quiet room thousands of years ago, moving pieces across a board. To us, it looks like a game. To them, it may have represented something much larger. A journey, a challenge, a passage through danger, a battle against forces of the underworld. The boundary between entertainment and religion was not always clear. That same idea appears in Egyptian tomb decoration. Paintings of food, boats, musicians, farmers, animals, gardens. Everything the deceased might need was represented. The tomb became a miniature version of life. Because if the images were preserved, perhaps the activities themselves could continue forever. But sometimes, the mummy itself creates a mystery. One of the strangest examples involves an ancient Egyptian woman known as Lady Chenet-Ah. For thousands of years, she remained inside an elaborately decorated cartonnage coffin. Cartonnage was made from layers of linen and papyrus covered with plaster, creating a material surprisingly similar to an ancient form of papier-mâché. It was light. It was strong. And under Egypt's dry climate, it could survive for thousands of years. But Lady Chenet-Ah's coffin contained a problem. There appeared to be no practical way to put her inside. There was no large opening, no obvious lid, no massive hinge, nothing that seemed capable of allowing a fully wrapped human body to enter. It almost looked as if the coffin had been built around her. For years, this was one of those mysteries that seemed almost supernatural. But modern technology provided an answer without opening the coffin. Researchers used CT scanning to look inside. Instead of physically disturbing the mummy, they created detailed three-dimensional images of the entire structure. And what they discovered revealed something remarkable about ancient craftsmanship. The coffin had indeed been constructed before the body was placed inside. But the cartonnage was softened with moisture. That allowed ancient embalmers to carefully reshape the material around the wrapped body. A hidden opening had been made along the back. After the body was inserted, the opening was tightly laced together. Then additional material concealed the repair. From the outside, the coffin appeared almost completely sealed. The mystery wasn't magic. It was engineering. And this pattern appears again and again throughout ancient Egypt. The people who prepared the dead understood materials, preservation, construction, and anatomy at a level that can still surprise modern researchers. But the real mystery is why they invested so much effort into preserving the dead. The answer lies in their beliefs. To the ancient Egyptians, death was not the end. It was a transition. The body had to remain recognizable because the deceased's existence continued beyond the physical world. The soul needed a place to return. The name needed to survive. The body needed protection. And everything required for the journey had to be prepared. Food, clothing, jewelry, amulets, weapons, furniture, even games. A tomb wasn't simply a grave. It was a carefully constructed survival system for the afterlife. And that belief created some of the most extraordinary archaeological discoveries ever made. But it also created a darker problem. The more valuable the burial, the greater the temptation for thieves. Ancient Egypt had professional grave robbers. They knew exactly where wealth was hidden. They knew how tombs were constructed. And sometimes they had inside information. This is why priests eventually began moving royal mummies into hidden caches. One of the most famous discoveries came in the late 19th century when archaeologists found a concealed chamber filled with royal mummies. Inside were kings who had ruled Egypt centuries earlier. Some of the most famous names in Egyptian history were suddenly brought back into the light. The bodies had been moved because the original tombs were no longer safe. The priests had attempted to protect the dead from people who wanted the treasures buried with them. But there was another reason. The ancient Egyptians understood that even a powerful pharaoh could become vulnerable once buried. A king might control an empire while alive, but underground, gold and jewels made him a target. And that leads to one of the strangest contradictions in Egyptian history. The civilization obsessed over preserving the dead. Yet many of its greatest tombs were eventually robbed. Some were stripped almost completely. Others were damaged beyond recognition. And in a few cases, the identity of the person buried inside disappeared with the stolen objects. That is why discoveries of intact or partially intact burials are so valuable. They provide something rare: context. A single golden object tells us something. An entire burial tells us a story. Where the object was placed, what surrounded it, which inscriptions appeared nearby, how the body was positioned, what materials were used. All of these details can reveal information that would otherwise be lost forever. And sometimes the objects tell stories that no historian expected. Take the discovery of ancient hands. Archaeologists uncovered 16 severed human right hands buried in several pits in Egypt. At first glance, it sounds like the scene of a horror story. But the explanation may be even more disturbing. Ancient Egyptian sources describe a practice in which warriors presented the right hands of defeated enemies as proof of victory. The hands could then be counted. Rewards could be given. And the battlefield victory could be transformed into a political symbol. But why the right hand? Because hands represented action and power. Taking the hand of an enemy wasn't simply physical mutilation. It could symbolically represent the destruction of that person's ability to fight. It transformed victory into something that could literally be carried away. And the discovery provides physical evidence for a practice that previously existed largely in texts and artistic depictions. This is one of archaeology's greatest powers. It can turn ancient stories into physical evidence. A painting shows a warrior holding something. A text describes a ritual. Then, thousands of years later, archaeologists uncover the remains of that exact practice. Suddenly, the ancient world becomes more real. But not every mystery is solved so easily. Sometimes archaeology creates even more questions. Consider the golden-tongued mummies discovered in Egypt. Several mummies were found with artificial tongues made from gold. Why? Ancient Egyptians believed the dead might need to communicate in the afterlife. Gold was associated with the divine and with permanence. So placing a golden tongue inside the mouth may have been intended to give the deceased the ability to speak before the gods. Think about how strange that sounds from a modern perspective. A person dies. Their body is prepared. Their organs are removed and preserved. Amulets are placed around them. Their face is protected. And finally, a golden tongue is added so they can speak in the next world. To the people who performed the ritual, however, none of this was strange. It was preparation, and preparation was everything. Even the smallest detail could matter. The eyes, the mouth, the fingers, the position of the arms, the objects placed beside the body. Every element had meaning. And that is why modern archaeology has to be careful. A tomb cannot be understood simply by looking at its most impressive treasure. The real story may be hidden in something tiny. A fragment of pottery, a piece of charcoal, a seed, a tooth, a footprint, a damaged inscription, or even a tiny scratch made by someone who lived thousands of years ago. These small details can completely change the story. A simple ceramic fragment can reveal trade. A seed can reveal diet. A damaged bone can reveal violence. A piece of fabric can reveal technology. And a name can bring an unknown person back into history. That last one may be the most powerful of all. Because ancient Egypt was obsessed with names. A person's name was part of their identity. If your name survived, part of you survived. If someone erased it, they were attempting to erase your existence. That is why some of the most important discoveries are not golden masks or enormous statues. They are inscriptions. A few symbols carved into stone can identify a ruler who had been forgotten for thousands of years. And sometimes, those symbols are missing. That is what makes several recently discovered royal tombs so intriguing. A massive burial chamber can belong to a powerful ruler, yet the name may be damaged or absent. The architecture tells us that the person was important. The decorations reveal their religious beliefs. The objects indicate their status. But their identity remains hidden. It's almost as if the tomb survived while the person did not. And perhaps somewhere beneath the desert, another sealed chamber is waiting. A chamber containing the missing name, the missing mummy, the missing chapter. Maybe Nefertiti, maybe another forgotten pharaoh, or perhaps someone history has never even mentioned. That is the strange thing about archaeology. Every answer can create another question. Every discovery can expose another mystery. And every sealed tomb reminds us that the ancient world still has secrets left to reveal. The sands of Egypt may look empty from the surface, but beneath them are thousands of years of human stories. Some were carved into stone. Some were written on papyrus. Some were preserved inside tombs. And some are still waiting in complete darkness. The question is not whether ancient Egypt has more secrets. It certainly does. The real question is this: how many of them are still waiting to be found? For thousands of years, the Nile was more than a river. It was a road, a source of life, a border, a highway connecting cities, temples, armies, merchants, and royal palaces. And somewhere beneath its waters, archaeologists have discovered evidence that the ancient world was far more connected than we once imagined. Imagine standing on the shore of ancient Alexandria. The Mediterranean stretches toward the horizon. Ships move through the harbor. Merchants shout from crowded docks. Priests carry offerings toward temples. Royal officials hurry between palaces. And somewhere nearby, an enormous ceremonial vessel glides across the water. It isn't a fishing boat. It isn't a simple cargo ship. It is a floating palace. Archaeologists have uncovered evidence of a massive ancient pleasure vessel that may have carried royalty and wealthy elites along the Nile. The ship was more than a means of transportation. It was a statement of power. Decorated cabins, rows of oarsmen, elegant construction, and enough space to transform a journey into a royal celebration. Ancient writers described these vessels centuries ago. For a long time, historians wondered whether the descriptions were exaggerated. Then archaeology began finding physical evidence, and suddenly those ancient texts didn't seem so impossible. The Nile was filled with boats of every kind. Some transported grain, others carried stone. Some transported soldiers, others carried ordinary passengers. And the wealthiest Egyptians could travel in vessels designed almost like floating estates. The river connected everything. But there was another side to this ancient waterway. The Nile could also destroy. Floods shaped Egyptian civilization. They brought fertile soil, but they could also damage buildings and destroy tombs. And one recently discovered royal tomb provides a dramatic example. The tomb belonged to Thutmose II, a pharaoh of Egypt's 18th dynasty. For more than a century, researchers knew his mummy existed, but his original tomb remained missing. Then archaeologists found it. At first, the discovery didn't look particularly impressive. The entrance was buried beneath debris. Floodwater had damaged the structure. The burial chamber was empty. But that emptiness turned out to be the clue. This wasn't a tomb that had simply been robbed. Something much stranger had happened. Floodwater had entered the tomb soon after the king was buried. The damage was severe enough that ancient officials apparently had to move the burial. The king's body and remaining funerary objects were relocated, and that may explain why his original tomb contained so little. Imagine the chaos. The burial had been completed. The king was finally resting underground. Then water began pouring into the chamber. Walls weakened. Decorations were damaged. Objects were displaced. The people responsible for protecting the royal dead had to act quickly. They opened the tomb again. They removed the king, and they searched for another place where his body could remain safe. Thousands of years later, archaeologists entered the same damaged tomb and found evidence of that emergency operation. The tomb itself became a message from the past, not just about death, but about disaster and human response. Even the ancient Egyptians, masters of monumental architecture, could not completely control nature. The same is true of many ancient sites across Egypt. Earthquakes collapsed temples. Floods buried settlements. Sand swallowed monuments. Rising groundwater destroyed structures. And sometimes entire cities disappeared beneath the landscape. One of the most fascinating examples can be found near Alexandria. Archaeologists investigating the area discovered evidence of a settlement that existed long before the Greeks established Alexandria. For centuries, the region was thought to have been largely empty before the arrival of Greek settlers. Then the excavations revealed something unexpected: ancient Egyptian mud brick structures, streets, drainage systems, religious buildings, and evidence suggesting military activity. The discovery changed the story. This wasn't an empty landscape waiting for Greek civilization. People had already been living, trading, building, and organizing communities there. And one small object helped reveal the connection: a ceramic vessel fragment carrying a royal seal. The name belonged to Meritaten, daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. Suddenly, the forgotten settlement was connected to one of the most controversial royal families in Egyptian history: Akhenaten, Nefertiti, Meritaten, Tutankhamun. 4 names connected to a period when Egypt's traditional religious order was turned upside down. Akhenaten attempted to replace Egypt's traditional gods with the worship of the Aten, the solar disk. He moved the royal court to a new capital. He changed artistic traditions. He changed religious practices. And he placed his own family at the center of this new world. But after his death, much of his legacy was dismantled. His city was abandoned. His monuments were destroyed or reused. His name was erased. And his family became increasingly difficult to trace. That makes discoveries associated with this period incredibly important. Because every new artifact can reconnect pieces of a story that ancient authorities deliberately tried to break apart. And sometimes, the evidence comes from something as ordinary as a wine jar. The ancient Egyptians produced wine on a surprisingly large scale. Vineyards existed in several regions. Wine was consumed by elites. It was used during rituals. It was traded. And it could travel long distances. A royal seal on a vessel can therefore tell archaeologists much more than who owned the jar. It can reveal political connections, trade networks, economic organization, and the geographic reach of royal authority. That means an ordinary-looking piece of pottery can become a map of an ancient empire. But there is another discovery that reveals something even more personal. Ancient Egyptians didn't just leave behind temples and tombs. They left behind games. One ancient board game, Senet, has been found in royal burials and other Egyptian sites. It may have been entertainment, but it also had religious meaning. The game was associated with the journey into the afterlife. Imagine a pharaoh sitting in a quiet room thousands of years ago, moving pieces across a board. To us, it looks like a game. To them, it may have represented something much larger. A journey, a challenge, a passage through danger, a battle against forces of the underworld. The boundary between entertainment and religion was not always clear. That same idea appears in Egyptian tomb decoration. Paintings of food, boats, musicians, farmers, animals, gardens. Everything the deceased might need was represented. The tomb became a miniature version of life. Because if the images were preserved, perhaps the activities themselves could continue forever. This belief explains why Egyptian tombs can feel strangely alive. A wall may show servants preparing food, musicians playing instruments, farmers harvesting crops, boats sailing along the Nile, a funeral procession moving toward the horizon. These weren't merely decorations. They were part of a system intended to preserve existence. And then there are the mummies. Some were royal. Others belonged to priests, officials, nobles, and ordinary people. One cemetery discovered in Egypt contained thousands of mummified individuals who were not kings or queens. They lived during the Roman and Byzantine periods, centuries after the great pharaohs. Their burials provide a reminder that mummification did not suddenly disappear with the end of the ancient kingdoms. It evolved. Different people used different techniques depending on wealth and status. Some received elaborate coffins. Others received simpler burials. But the desire to preserve the body remained. Even animals were mummified. Cats, crocodiles, bulls, birds, baboons. The animal wasn't necessarily important because of its individual identity. It could represent a deity. A sacred animal could become a physical connection between humans and the divine. But these discoveries also reveal something darker. Some sacred animals appear to have suffered during captivity. Researchers studying mummified baboons found evidence suggesting certain animals may have been kept indoors and deprived of sunlight. Their bones showed signs consistent with poor living conditions. The religious system that honored them may also have created suffering. This is another reason archaeology matters. It doesn't simply confirm ancient beliefs. It reveals their consequences. The ancient world wasn't a perfect civilization of mysterious geniuses. It was a human society. People loved. People fought. People traded. People lied. People worshipped. People suffered. People built monuments. And people died. The greatest discoveries are powerful because they bring those people back into focus. A golden ring. A broken cup. A child's toy. A written receipt. A mummy. A forgotten name. Each one gives us another glimpse of individuals who lived thousands of years before us. And perhaps that is the real mystery. We often search ancient Egypt for something enormous. A hidden chamber. A lost city. A legendary treasure. The tomb of Nefertiti. The burial of an unknown pharaoh. But sometimes the most extraordinary discovery is much smaller. A human fingerprint preserved on ancient material. A piece of graffiti scratched into a boat. A seed left inside a burial. A fragment of writing that survived when everything around it disappeared. Those tiny traces prove something enormous. Someone was here. Someone touched this. Someone wrote this. Someone believed they would be remembered. And now, thousands of years later, we are still trying to understand them. The Nile continues to flow. The temples continue to stand. The desert continues to shift. And beneath the ground, countless stories remain sealed. Some may already be waiting beneath places archaeologists have excavated hundreds of times. Others may lie beneath completely unknown landscapes. And somewhere, perhaps behind a wall, no one has opened yet. There may be an answer to one of Egypt's greatest mysteries. Maybe it will reveal Nefertiti. Maybe another forgotten pharaoh. Maybe nothing at all. But until that chamber is opened, the possibility remains. And that is what makes archaeology so haunting. The past doesn't speak loudly. It whispers. Through stone, through bone, through broken pottery, through names. And sometimes, if we are patient enough, those whispers become a story. There are moments in archaeology when a discovery doesn't simply reveal something new. It forces us to question everything we thought we already knew. Because sometimes, the object buried beneath the sand isn't just a treasure. It's evidence. Evidence that a forgotten city existed. Evidence that an unknown ruler once held power. Evidence that people traveled farther than historians imagined. And sometimes evidence that an entire chapter of history was deliberately erased. Ancient Egypt has given us all of these mysteries. But perhaps none is more disturbing than the discovery of places that seem to have been deliberately forgotten. Imagine walking across a desert landscape where nothing appears to exist. No buildings, no roads, no signs of life, just sand and stone stretching toward the horizon. Then archaeologists begin removing the surface. A wall appears, then another, a street, a drainage channel, a room, a temple. Suddenly, the empty desert isn't empty anymore. It is a city that has been silent for more than 3,000 years. Near Alexandria, archaeologists uncovered exactly this kind of forgotten settlement. The discovery was surprising because the region was long believed to have been largely unoccupied before the arrival of the Greeks. But the ruins told another story. Ancient Egyptian mud bricks were found beneath later structures. The layout of the settlement revealed organized streets. Drainage systems showed careful planning. And religious structures suggested that the community wasn't simply a temporary village. It was part of something much larger. Then came the evidence that made the discovery even more fascinating. A royal seal. The name connected the site to Meritaten, daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. Suddenly, the forgotten settlement was no longer just another ancient town. It had a connection to one of the most controversial royal families Egypt had ever known. Akhenaten's reign remains one of the strangest periods in Egyptian history. He attempted to transform the religious system of an entire civilization. For generations, Egyptians had worshipped a vast collection of gods and goddesses: Osiris, Isis, Horus, Amun, Thoth, Set, and countless others. Akhenaten wanted to change that. He elevated the Aten, represented as the radiant solar disk, above the traditional gods. He established a new capital. He changed temple practices, and he encouraged a revolutionary artistic style. The royal family was shown in ways that looked radically different from earlier Egyptian art. Their bodies were elongated. Their features were softer. Their family life appeared unusually intimate. Akhenaten and Nefertiti were shown with their daughters. They embraced. They worshipped together. They lived in a world dominated by sunlight. But revolutions rarely survive their creators. After Akhenaten's death, Egypt began reversing the changes. The old gods returned. The temples reopened. The new capital was abandoned. And the names of Akhenaten and his family were removed from monuments. It was almost as if Egypt itself wanted to forget that the revolution had happened. But archaeology is cruel to attempts at forgetting. Stone survives. Broken pottery survives. Buried buildings survive. And eventually, someone digs them up. That's why the discovery of the forgotten city matters. It provides another piece of evidence showing how far the influence of Akhenaten's world may have reached. It also raises a larger question. How much of the Amarna period is still missing? We know about the royal family. We know about the new capital. We know about the religious revolution. But what happened to the ordinary people who lived through it? Where did soldiers go? Where did merchants go? What happened to the administrators? How did communities respond when the king suddenly changed the religion of the entire country? Archaeological settlements can answer questions that royal monuments cannot. A temple tells us what rulers wanted people to see. A house tells us how people actually lived. A storage room tells us what they consumed. A workshop reveals what they produced. And a garbage dump can sometimes reveal more truth than a palace. This is why archaeologists pay attention to ordinary objects. Ancient pottery fragments may seem worthless, but a single piece can reveal where a vessel was made. Its clay can identify its origin. Its decoration can identify a culture. Its residue can reveal what it once contained. And its location can reveal trade. A broken wine jar can therefore become evidence of an ancient economic network. Wine was valuable. It required vineyards, workers, storage, transportation, and distribution. If wine production existed in a region previously thought to be unsuitable for it, historians have to reconsider how ancient Egyptians used the landscape. And that is one of the recurring patterns in archaeology. The ancient world keeps turning out to be more connected than we imagined. Egypt wasn't isolated. Its ships traveled the Mediterranean. Its armies moved into neighboring territories. Its merchants traded with distant regions. Its ideas crossed borders. Its religious traditions influenced surrounding cultures. And foreigners came to Egypt carrying their own beliefs. This becomes especially obvious during the Greco-Roman period. Egyptian temples continued to function, but Greek and Roman influences became deeply embedded in Egyptian culture. New gods appeared in combined forms. One fascinating example is Zeus Cassios. Archaeologists discovered evidence of a temple associated with this deity in the Sinai region. Zeus was a Greek sky god. Cassios was connected to a sacred mountain and an older Near Eastern tradition. The combination reveals something important. Ancient religions were not always separate boxes. They could merge. A god could cross borders. A name could change. A local deity could be identified with a foreign one. And a temple could become a meeting point between cultures. This process happened repeatedly across the ancient world. People moved. Ideas moved. Religions moved. Technology moved. And sometimes the evidence survives in unexpected forms. A ring, a statue, a coin, a piece of pottery, even a tattoo. Archaeologists have discovered ancient Egyptian mummies with preserved tattoos. Some of the designs appear to have been connected to protection and fertility. One figure appears repeatedly in Egyptian protective traditions. Bes. Unlike the elegant gods normally carved in monumental temples, Bes was short, muscular, and often portrayed with a comical appearance. He wasn't intimidating in the traditional sense, but he was believed to protect households, women, children, and childbirth. That makes the discovery of protective tattoos especially interesting. The marks may have functioned as permanent symbols of protection. Imagine carrying a religious symbol on your body for your entire life. It couldn't be removed. It traveled with you. And after death, it remained. The body itself became a canvas for belief. But ancient Egyptians weren't only masters of religious symbolism. They were engineers, astronomers, mathematicians, architects, and inventors. Some ancient statues even contained mechanical components. One wooden figure associated with the goddess Hathor was found to contain an internal mechanism. Researchers discovered a system involving an axis and moving components. When activated, the statue's arm could move. To an ancient observer, that might have looked miraculous. A statue of a deity seemingly moving on its own. But behind the mystery was mechanical engineering. The same principle appears throughout ancient history. Technology can look like magic when its mechanism is hidden. And ancient engineers knew the power of hidden mechanisms. Doors could move. Objects could rotate. Water could flow automatically. Weights could trigger movement. The Greeks later developed sophisticated automata. But earlier civilizations were already experimenting with mechanical systems. This raises a fascinating question. How much ancient technology have we failed to recognize simply because the mechanisms were made from materials that didn't survive? Wood rots. Leather disappears. Organic fibers decay. Metal corrodes. What remains is often only stone. So when archaeologists discover evidence of ancient machinery, we may be seeing only the skeleton of a much larger technological tradition. And then there are the things that survived almost perfectly. Mummies. Some preserved through deliberate embalming. Others preserved because of Egypt's extraordinary environment. Dry sand can remove moisture. Salt can slow decomposition. Sealed chambers can protect bodies from insects and oxygen. The result is a strange kind of time capsule. A person dies. Thousands of years pass. And then someone opens the burial. The body is still there. The face remains. The clothes remain. Sometimes even the food placed beside them survives. It's difficult not to feel a connection. These people were not symbols when they were alive. They had families. They had fears. They had ambitions. They complained. They laughed. They got sick. They ate meals. They played games. They fell in love. They worried about the future. And eventually, they died. Their civilization disappeared. But fragments of their lives survived. A fingerprint in clay. A name carved into stone. A game board. A golden tongue. A tattoo. A broken wine jar. A sealed tomb. Thousands of years later, these fragments become our only way to hear their voices. And perhaps that's why the greatest archaeological mysteries aren't necessarily about treasure. They're about identity. Who was the unknown king? Where was Nefertiti buried? Who built the forgotten city? Why was a tomb abandoned? Who wrote the inscription? Who left the graffiti? Who placed the golden tongue inside the mummy? Every object is connected to a person. Every tomb belonged to someone. Every city was filled with lives. And somewhere beneath Egypt's desert, countless names remain hidden. Some may belong to kings, others to soldiers, priests, craftsmen, children, farmers, merchants. People history never considered important enough to record. Yet archaeology gives them something they never expected, a second chance to be remembered. And perhaps the next excavation will reveal another forgotten name, another sealed chamber, another city, another impossible object. Because Egypt has already shown us that even after thousands of years, the ground beneath our feet can still contain evidence capable of rewriting the past. The desert may look silent, but it is not empty. It is a library, and every buried object is a page. We have read only a fraction of it. The most astonishing chapters may still be underground. For thousands of years, the sands of Egypt have hidden secrets that were never meant to be found. Tombs were sealed, cities disappeared, royal names were erased, and entire chapters of history were buried beneath layers of stone and dust. But every once in a while, archaeologists uncover something that does more than add another artifact to a museum. It forces us to question what we thought we already knew. And sometimes, the most disturbing discoveries are not the ones filled with gold. They are the ones that leave us with questions. Deep beneath the ancient landscape of Egypt, archaeologists have repeatedly discovered evidence of a civilization that was far more complicated than the familiar image of pyramids, pharaohs, and mummies. There were underground passages, hidden chambers, forgotten rulers, mysterious rituals, elaborate burials, and technologies that still make researchers stop and wonder how ancient craftsmen achieved what they did with the tools available to them. One of the most fascinating examples comes from the world of ancient Egyptian burials. For the Egyptians, death was not the end. It was a transition. A person was expected to continue existing in another realm, and everything about the burial was designed around that belief. The body had to be preserved. The name had to survive. Objects had to accompany the deceased. Spells had to guide the soul. Even the tomb itself could function as a kind of machine designed to move the dead safely into eternity. That belief explains why some Egyptian tombs were constructed with astonishing complexity. But it also explains something darker: the fear of disturbing the dead. Ancient inscriptions sometimes warned people against entering sacred spaces. Modern audiences often interpret these warnings as evidence of curses, but the reality may have been more practical. Tombs contained dangerous substances, decaying organic material, bacteria, mold, and in some underground environments, radioactive radon gas. A sealed chamber could remain isolated for thousands of years, creating conditions that would be extremely unhealthy for anyone entering it without protection. That possibility becomes especially intriguing when we look at the famous story surrounding Tutankhamun. When Howard Carter and his team entered the young pharaoh's tomb in 1922, the discovery became one of the greatest archaeological sensations in history. Gold, statues, furniture, chariots, weapons, jewelry, and the famous burial mask emerged from a chamber that had remained hidden for more than 3 millennia. Then the deaths began. Or at least, that's how the story was remembered. Lord Carnarvon, the wealthy patron who helped finance the excavation, died shortly after the tomb was opened. Newspapers seized on the story. The idea of an ancient Egyptian curse spread around the world. But when historians examine the evidence, the story becomes much less supernatural. The people associated with the excavation did not all die mysteriously. Many lived for decades. Howard Carter himself survived for years after opening the tomb and died at the age of 64. Others died from ordinary illnesses, infections, heart conditions, pneumonia, and unrelated causes. Still, the legend refuses to disappear. And perhaps that's because the real story is almost as fascinating as the fictional one. The Egyptians understood that a tomb was more than a room underground. It was a carefully protected environment. They constructed it to preserve the dead, conceal valuables, and maintain the boundary between the living and the deceased. Yet sometimes, those boundaries failed. Floods destroyed tombs. Earthquakes collapsed chambers. Grave robbers broke through walls. Water damaged burial goods. And in some cases, priests themselves had to move royal mummies centuries after their original burials. That is exactly what happened to Thutmose II. For generations, archaeologists knew the pharaoh's mummy, but his original tomb remained uncertain. Then researchers investigating a damaged tomb in the Theban mountains discovered evidence that changed the picture. The tomb had suffered catastrophic flooding. Water had entered the burial complex soon after the king's death, damaging its contents and forcing ancient officials to move the body and remaining grave goods somewhere safer. Inside the tomb, researchers found evidence of royal burial rituals, including fragments associated with funerary texts and inscriptions connected with the afterlife. But perhaps the most fascinating question was not what they found. It was what was missing. Where did the rest of the burial equipment go? If the ancient Egyptians removed the king's mummy and treasures, they had to put them somewhere. That means another undiscovered location may still exist. And this is where archaeology becomes something closer to detective work. Every fragment matters. A piece of alabaster can reveal a name. A broken vessel can identify a ruler. A tiny inscription can connect 2 locations separated by centuries. Even the position of a wall can reveal how people moved through a tomb. One artifact may appear insignificant by itself. Together, hundreds of fragments can reconstruct an entire lost story. That is also why the discovery of mysterious royal tombs at Abydos is so important. Abydos was not simply another cemetery. To the ancient Egyptians, it was sacred ground, closely associated with Osiris, the god of death, resurrection, and the afterlife. Pharaohs wanted their names connected with this sacred landscape because being remembered was itself a form of immortality. But one recently discovered royal tomb created an extraordinary problem. The tomb was enormous. The architecture clearly suggested someone important. The walls were decorated. Protective deities appeared at the entrance. The burial complex had the characteristics expected of a royal monument. But the name of the ruler was missing. Imagine discovering the tomb of a king and realizing that the one piece of information you desperately need has been erased. For the ancient Egyptians, that was more than an inconvenience. It was almost an attack on the person's existence. The Egyptians believed that a person's name, the Ren, was deeply connected to identity and eternal survival. If your name continued to be spoken, remembered, and written, part of you continued to exist. To erase a person's name was therefore an attempt to erase that person from eternity. Perhaps that is exactly what happened to the mysterious ruler of Abydos. The tomb may belong to a forgotten king from a chaotic period when Egypt was divided between competing powers. A dynasty that once ruled part of the country may have been deliberately erased from later historical records. And that creates one of the greatest mysteries in Egyptian archaeology. How many rulers disappeared simply because later generations decided they should be forgotten? We tend to imagine history as something permanent. It isn't. History is fragile. A flood can destroy a document. A fire can erase an archive. A tomb robber can scatter a burial. A later king can order inscriptions destroyed. And thousands of years later, archaeologists are left trying to reconstruct the past from fragments. But Egypt isn't the only civilization that left behind mysteries like these. Across the ancient world, archaeologists have discovered bodies preserved in ways that seem almost impossible. One remarkable example is the mummy known as Lady Di, discovered in China. When researchers opened her burial, they encountered something extraordinary. Her body was remarkably preserved after more than 2,000 years. Her skin remained soft. Her joints could still move. Hair and other delicate tissues survived. The burial itself was equally impressive, with multiple nested coffins, layers of silk, charcoal, clay, food, clothing, cosmetics, musical instruments, and hundreds of objects intended to accompany her into the next world. Even the contents of her stomach helped researchers reconstruct the final moments of her life. She had eaten watermelon shortly before she died. A tiny detail. But suddenly, a woman who lived more than 2,000 years ago becomes strangely human. She wasn't just a mummy. She was someone who had a final meal. Someone who had preferences. Someone who lived inside a family. Someone who worried about things. Someone who expected another day. And then there was no next day. Archaeology constantly produces moments like this. A fingerprint. A footprint. A piece of graffiti. A child's toy. A food fragment. A name scratched into a wall. These details can be more powerful than gold because they connect us directly to people who lived thousands of years before us. And perhaps that is the greatest mystery of all. Ancient civilizations may seem impossibly distant, but their lives were filled with the same things that occupy ours. They traveled. They traded. They built homes. They played games. They celebrated festivals. They worried about death. They loved their families. They wanted their names remembered. And they tried to understand a world they could not fully explain. Thousands of years later, we are doing exactly the same thing. We stand beneath ancient monuments and ask how they were built. We enter forgotten tombs and ask who was buried there. We discover mysterious tunnels and wonder why someone carved them. We find sealed chambers and ask what lies beyond the walls. And every answer seems to create another question. That is why these discoveries matter. They are not simply stories about the past. They are reminders that the past is still incomplete. There are still tombs beneath the desert. There are still cities beneath the soil. There are still names waiting to be recovered. And somewhere beneath the ancient landscape, there may be another sealed chamber that has been waiting for thousands of years. Waiting in darkness. Waiting for someone to find it. And when that door finally opens, we may discover that the greatest mysteries of ancient Egypt were never really lost. They were simply hidden. There are moments in archaeology when a discovery doesn't simply reveal something new. It changes the question entirely. For centuries, we have looked at ancient Egypt through the monuments that survived. The pyramids, the temples, the tombs, the statues, the golden masks. But those monuments represent only the visible surface of a civilization that stretched across thousands of years. Beneath that surface is another Egypt. An Egypt of forgotten workshops, buried streets, hidden chambers, mysterious rituals, abandoned settlements, and people whose names disappeared from history. And sometimes, the smallest discovery can open a door into that hidden world. Imagine walking through the desert and finding 16 human hands buried underground. Not skeletons, not complete bodies, hands. And strangely, almost every one of them is a right hand. At first, it sounds like something from a horror story, but archaeologists eventually connected the discovery to something far more disturbing. Ancient Egyptian inscriptions and artwork describe a practice in which warriors presented the severed right hands of defeated enemies as proof of victory. In some cases, these trophies were presented to officials in exchange for rewards. The symbolism was brutal. The hand represented strength and action. Taking the hand of an enemy wasn't simply killing them. It was a physical demonstration that their ability to fight had been destroyed. And this wasn't necessarily a legend. Archaeological evidence suggests that such practices really happened. The discovery provides an uncomfortable reminder that ancient Egypt was not only a civilization of art and architecture. It was also an empire. And empires are built through conflict. Egyptian armies fought against neighboring kingdoms, including the Hyksos and other foreign powers. Soldiers traveled long distances, fought battles, captured prisoners, and brought wealth back to the Nile Valley. Behind every magnificent temple was a political system. Behind every royal statue was military power. And behind every victory inscription were people who had actually fought and died. This is one reason archaeology can be so unsettling. The monuments often show the glory. The ground sometimes reveals the cost. But the mysteries of ancient Egypt aren't limited to war. Some of the most fascinating discoveries concern something much more peaceful: writing. Long before modern books, ancient Egyptians recorded their beliefs, medical knowledge, rituals, dreams, prayers, and ideas about death on papyrus. One of the most famous traditions was the collection of funerary texts often known today as the Book of the Dead. Despite the name, it wasn't really a single book. It was a collection of spells and instructions designed to help the deceased navigate the afterlife. And these texts reveal just how complicated Egyptian ideas about death really were. The ancient Egyptians imagined the afterlife as a dangerous journey. The deceased had to pass through gates, encounter supernatural beings, answer questions, and prove that they were worthy of entering the next world. One of the most famous scenes shows the deceased standing before a scale. On one side was the person's heart. On the other was the feather of Ma'at, representing truth, balance, and cosmic order. If the heart was too heavy with wrongdoing, it could not pass the test. The consequences were terrifying. The heart could be devoured by a monstrous creature known as Ammit. But if the heart balanced correctly, the deceased could continue into the afterlife. Think about what that means. The Egyptians didn't imagine death as simply disappearing. They imagined it as a trial, a journey, a final examination. and they spent enormous amounts of time preparing for it. That is why mummies were preserved. That is why tombs contained food, clothing, jewelry, tools, furniture, and religious objects. And that is why even artificial eyes could be placed on the dead. The body was being prepared for eternity. One remarkable example is the mysterious woman known as Lady Chanet Ah. For years, researchers were puzzled by her coffin. The sarcophagus appeared to have no obvious opening large enough for her body. There was only a tiny gap near the feet. So how did the ancient embalmers get her inside? The answer eventually emerged through modern CT scanning. The coffin had not been built around her in the conventional way. Instead, the embalmers created the outer structure first and then softened the material with moisture. They carefully shaped it around her wrapped body. A hidden opening along the back allowed them to complete the process. Then they closed and laced the opening so effectively that thousands of years later, it looked almost seamless. No magic, no supernatural force, just engineering. And that may be one of the most important lessons archaeology continues to teach us. The ancient world was not primitive in the way we sometimes imagine. People who lived thousands of years ago were capable of solving incredibly complex problems. They understood materials. They understood geometry. They understood preservation. They understood human anatomy. And when they encountered a problem, they invented solutions. Sometimes those solutions survived for thousands of years. The same is true in another mysterious part of ancient Egyptian technology: automated statues. At first, the idea sounds impossible. A machine hidden inside a religious statue. But researchers examining an ancient wooden figure discovered something remarkable. Inside the statue was a mechanical system involving an axis and pulley-like mechanism. When activated, the statue could move its arm. To an ancient observer, this might have appeared miraculous, a deity seemingly responding to human activity. But beneath the illusion was mechanical engineering. This is important because the ancient Egyptians were not simply builders. They were experimenters. They studied the movement of the stars. They developed calendars. They measured land. They designed irrigation systems. They built enormous structures, and they understood that machines could create effects that looked almost supernatural. The boundary between technology and religion was therefore much thinner than we might expect. A machine could become a miracle. A statue could become an apparent living presence. And a temple could become a stage where carefully designed movements, sounds, light, and architecture created an experience that felt otherworldly. That brings us to another strange discovery: ancient Egyptian animal mummies. Millions of animals were mummified in Egypt. Cats, crocodiles, ibises, bulls, baboons. Some were associated with specific gods. The animals were not simply pets. They could function as sacred offerings. People could purchase an animal mummy and dedicate it to a deity in the hope that their prayer would be heard. But behind this religious practice was a massive industry. Animals had to be bred, raised, killed, embalmed, wrapped, stored, sold. Entire networks developed around sacred animal cults. And sometimes the archaeological evidence suggests that the reality was far darker than the beautiful religious imagery suggests. Researchers studying mummified baboons have found signs that some animals may have been kept in captivity under poor conditions. Some showed evidence of nutritional deficiencies and limited exposure to sunlight. The sacred animals may have been treated as divine representatives, but they were still living creatures. And that contrast between spiritual importance and physical suffering is difficult to ignore. It reminds us that ancient civilizations were complicated. They could produce extraordinary beauty while also participating in practices we would find disturbing. That complexity becomes even more obvious when we look at Egyptian tattoos. Archaeologists have discovered evidence that women in ancient Egypt sometimes decorated their bodies with tattoos. Some of these markings may have had protective or religious significance. Images associated with fertility, motherhood, and protective deities appear among the surviving examples. One particularly interesting figure is Bes, the dwarf-like deity associated with protection, childbirth, music, and celebration. His appearance was unusual. He wasn't elegant like many Egyptian gods. He was short. He had a broad face, often a protruding tongue, and a deliberately strange appearance. Yet his image was believed to protect people from danger, especially mothers and children. It is fascinating because the same civilization that built enormous temples for gods with human and animal forms also used tiny images of protective deities on the human body. Religion was everywhere, on walls, on coffins, on jewelry, on statues, on skin, even in the smallest objects. And perhaps this is why Egypt continues to fascinate us. It wasn't just one civilization. It was thousands of years of changing beliefs layered on top of one another. Kingdoms rose, dynasties collapsed, foreign rulers arrived, religions changed, cities were abandoned, new temples were built over older ones, names were erased, others were restored. And sometimes, thousands of years later, archaeologists uncover two completely different periods occupying the same piece of ground. A royal tomb, then a Roman pottery workshop, then a medieval cemetery. The land remembers everything, even when people forget. This is why an excavation is never simply about digging down. It is about moving backward through time. Every layer represents a different chapter. The top may belong to a modern village. Beneath it could be a medieval burial. Below that, a Roman workshop. Deeper still, an ancient Egyptian settlement. And beneath everything, perhaps, a forgotten royal monument. The deeper archaeologists go, the more complicated the story becomes. And sometimes the most exciting discovery is not the treasure they find. It is the possibility that something is still missing. A lost name, a hidden chamber, a relocated mummy, a forgotten city, a sealed tomb. A fragment of evidence that has not yet been connected to the rest of the puzzle. Because archaeology rarely gives us the complete story. It gives us pieces. And we have to assemble them. Some pieces fit immediately. Others don't. Some force historians to rewrite old theories. And some simply create new mysteries. That may be the most remarkable thing about ancient Egypt. After thousands of years of excavation, we still haven't reached the end. The desert is still hiding secrets. The mountains are still hiding tombs. The ancient cities are still buried beneath modern landscapes. And somewhere beneath the stones, there may be an object waiting to answer a question we've been asking for centuries. Or perhaps it will do something even more dangerous. It may force us to ask a completely different question. Because the past doesn't always give us answers. Sometimes it gives us a deeper mystery. And that is exactly why the search continues. There is something deeply unsettling about ancient Egypt. Not because of the curses, not because of the mummies, not because of the stories of pharaohs who supposedly refused to die. It is unsettling because, after thousands of years, Egypt still refuses to give us the complete story. Every time archaeologists believe they have mapped another piece of the ancient world, something appears beneath the sand and changes the picture again. A forgotten tomb, a buried city, a mysterious mummy. A hidden passage, a name that history tried to erase. And sometimes a discovery so unexpected that it makes us wonder how much of the ancient world is still waiting beneath our feet. Think about what we have already uncovered. We have entered the tomb of Tutankhamun and stared into a world sealed for more than 3,000 years. We have found the tomb of Thutmose II, a royal burial damaged by ancient floods and stripped of much of its original contents. We have uncovered enormous royal monuments at Abydos, including a mysterious tomb whose ruler's identity remains uncertain. We have discovered ancient bodies preserved so remarkably that researchers can reconstruct the final meals, diseases, lifestyles, and even physical conditions of people who died thousands of years ago. We have found human hands buried as trophies of war. We have discovered animal mummies numbering in the millions. We have found ancient mechanical devices hidden inside statues. We have uncovered evidence of tattoos, sacred animals, funerary texts, workshops, calendars, temples, and entire communities that disappeared from the historical record. And yet these discoveries may represent only the beginning. Because the Egypt we see today is not the Egypt that once existed. The Nile changed its course. The coastline moved. Earthquakes destroyed cities. Floods buried buildings. Wind covered monuments. Human settlements grew over ancient streets. And entire landscapes disappeared beneath layers of soil. Some ancient cities that were once crowded with people are now nothing more than archaeological traces. Some tombs were deliberately hidden. Others were forgotten accidentally. And some may still be completely untouched. That possibility is what keeps archaeologists searching. Imagine a sealed chamber somewhere beneath the desert. No modern footprint has ever crossed its entrance. No flashlight has ever illuminated its walls. Inside, the air has been trapped for thousands of years. Maybe there are inscriptions. Maybe there are statues. Maybe there are objects belonging to a ruler whose name has vanished from history. Or perhaps there is nothing valuable at all. Maybe the chamber contains the belongings of an ordinary person. A bowl, a necklace, a wooden tool, a child's toy, a fragment of clothing, something that would have been worthless to a grave robber, but priceless to archaeology. Because gold tells us that someone was wealthy. A broken cup can tell us how they lived. A cooking vessel can reveal what they ate. A damaged tool can show what they did for work. A footprint can tell us that someone stood there. And a single name can bring an entire forgotten person back into history. This is why the smallest discoveries can sometimes become the most important. A royal tomb might make headlines, but a simple piece of pottery can change our understanding of trade. A tiny inscription can reveal a previously unknown settlement. A plant seed can tell us what people were eating. A fragment of wood can reveal how old a structure really is. Archaeology is not treasure hunting. It is reconstruction. The goal isn't simply to find something spectacular. It is to understand how the pieces fit together. And modern technology is making that possible in ways earlier archaeologists could never have imagined. Researchers can now use CT scanning to look inside mummies without unwrapping them. They can use ground-penetrating radar to search beneath the surface. They can create three-dimensional models of tombs. They can analyze microscopic traces of materials. They can identify ancient DNA. They can examine pigments that are almost invisible to the human eye. They can reconstruct landscapes that disappeared thousands of years ago. The desert itself can now be read like a map. And every new technique increases the possibility that something hidden will finally reveal itself. But there is another reason these discoveries matter. They remind us that history is not finished. For a long time, textbooks presented ancient civilizations as if their stories were already complete. Pharaohs had names. Dynasties had dates. Wars had winners. Cities had locations. Everything appeared neatly organized. But real history isn't neat. It is fragmented. There are gaps, contradictions, missing records, destroyed monuments, forgotten rulers, and entire periods where we barely know what happened. The mysterious rulers of Abydos are a perfect example. For years, their existence was uncertain. Then archaeology provided evidence that they were real. One discovery transformed speculation into history. That means another discovery could do the same thing again. There could be rulers we don't know existed, cities we haven't identified, burials we haven't found, political events that never made it into surviving records. and perhaps even explanations for mysteries that have confused historians for generations. What happened to certain royal families? Where did missing burial treasures go? How were some enormous monuments actually organized? Why were particular settlements abandoned? What caused certain tombs to be relocated? Who ordered certain names erased? And what happened during the periods when Egypt's political system suddenly changed? These aren't questions from mythology. They are real historical problems. And the evidence is still out there. Buried, broken, waiting. There is something almost poetic about that. The ancient Egyptians spent enormous effort trying to defeat forgetting. They carved their names into stone. They built monuments that could be seen from miles away. They placed portraits of themselves inside temples. They wrote prayers onto walls. They preserved their bodies. They surrounded themselves with objects intended to carry their identities into eternity. Their greatest fear was not simply death, it was being forgotten. And thousands of years later, archaeologists are doing the opposite. They are remembering them. A forgotten woman becomes a person again when researchers reconstruct her life. A nameless king becomes a historical possibility when his tomb is identified. A worker becomes visible when archaeologists find his tools. A child becomes real when a small object from their daily life survives beneath the soil. Even a person whose name will never be recovered can still leave a trace. And sometimes that trace is enough. Perhaps that is the greatest irony of ancient Egypt. They built for eternity, but almost everything they created eventually changed. Temples collapsed. Statues broke. Tombs flooded. Paint faded. Names disappeared. Cities vanished. And yet, against all odds, pieces survived. A fragment here. A burial there. A wall beneath the sand. A sealed chamber. A tiny inscription. Enough pieces to let us look backward across thousands of years. And perhaps the most astonishing part is that the story is still being written. Every excavation adds another sentence. Every scan reveals another possibility. Every unexplained object becomes another question. And somewhere beneath Egypt, the next sentence is already waiting. Maybe it is inside a tomb that has never been entered. Maybe beneath a forgotten settlement. Maybe beneath a temple that we already believe we understand. Maybe behind a wall that looks completely ordinary. The next discovery could be small, or it could be enormous. It could confirm what historians already suspect, or it could destroy a theory that has survived for decades. That is the danger of archaeology. The evidence doesn't care what we believe. If the evidence says we were wrong, the story changes. And that is exactly how history should work. Not as a collection of comfortable answers, but as a search for what actually happened. So when you look at the pyramids, don't just see monuments. Think about the workers who built them. When you see a mummy, don't just see an ancient body. Think about the person who once had a name, a family, a voice, and a future they expected to live. When you see a tomb, don't just see stone. Think about the thousands of decisions made by people who believed that what they were building would survive forever. And when you see the desert, don't assume it is empty. The desert is an archive. Its pages are buried beneath the surface. Some have already been opened. Millions more may still be closed. For more than 3,000 years, the silence held. Then someone found a doorway. A scientist brushed away the dust. A camera entered the darkness. And suddenly the dead began speaking again. Not with voices, with evidence, with names, with objects, with bones, with inscriptions, with architecture, with clues that survived long after the people who created them disappeared. And perhaps that is the real mystery of ancient Egypt. It isn't that the civilization vanished. It is that so much of it survived. Enough for us to keep searching. Enough for us to keep asking. enough for us to realize that the greatest discoveries may not be behind us. They may still be buried ahead of us. Somewhere beneath the sand, behind a sealed wall, beneath an ancient mountain, there could be a discovery capable of changing everything we think we know. And when that moment comes, history will not end. It will begin again. Because every ancient secret we uncover doesn't close the book. It turns the page. And somewhere in the darkness, another page is waiting to be opened.